She pulled her sleeve down so hard the fabric tore at the seam. The stagecoach had barely stopped rolling when she yanked it back up, fingers trembling, pressing the thin cotton against the dark bruise spreading from her wrist to her elbow like a storm cloud that never left. 20 years old. Alone in a territory she couldn't find on a map 3 weeks ago. And somewhere behind her, across 600 miles of railroad track and broken promises, a man who called himself her family was probably already looking for her. If you've ever had to run from someone who was supposed to love you, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's begin. The stagecoach rolled into Willow Creek, Wyoming territory on a Tuesday morning in late June of 1887, trailing a wall of red dust that coated everything within 50 feet. Emma Collins felt the wheels slow beneath her and pressed her back harder against the wooden seat, as though putting distance between herself and the door might delay what waited on the other side of it. She had been awake for 31 hours. She knew because she had counted every one of them sitting rigid and sleepless through 2 overnight stops, watching the other passengers drift off with the careless ease of people who had nothing to fear from closing their eyes. Emma had not closed hers. Every time the coach rocked, or a branch scraped the roof, or another passenger shifted in sleep, her whole body locked up like a trap, snapping shut. Old habit. The kind of habit that lived in your muscles long after your mind told it to stop. She pressed her left arm against her ribs and breathed through her nose. The bruise there was the worst. Victor had caught her 3 nights before she left St. Louis, not because she had done anything wrong, but because he had come home in a mood that needed somewhere to go, and Emma was the closest target. She had learned years ago not to cry out. Crying out only made it last longer. When the stagecoach door swung open, a blast of dry heat rolled in, and the other passengers began moving. Emma sat still. A woman across from her, plump, pink-cheeked, traveling to meet her sister in Cheyenne, gave her a curious look as she gathered her bags. "End of the line, honey?" the woman said not unkindly. Emma stood up. Her legs felt like they belonged to someone else. She had answered Luke Harper's advertisement 6 weeks ago, writing the letter 3 times before she got the words right. Not because she cared about impressing him, she had stopped caring about impressing men around the time she turned 15, and understood that no amount of good behavior changed what Victor was. She had rewritten the letter because she needed it to sound normal. Calm. Like a woman choosing a new life rather than fleeing the ruins of the old one. Hardworking. Honest. Can cook and keep accounts. Willing to relocate. No family obligations. That last part had been the most important. No family obligations. No one who would come looking. No one to contact if things went wrong. She had not told Luke Harper about her uncle. She had not told him about the years of isolation, the locked doors, the inventory of reasons Victor gave for every bruise and broken thing. She had told him she was 20 years old, originally from Ohio, and had been living with a relative in St. Louis following her parents' death. All of that was technically true. The rest she carried alone. She stepped down from the coach and the Wyoming sun hit her full in the face. After the dim interior of the stagecoach, it felt like walking into a wall. She blinked, adjusted the grip on her carpet bag, everything she owned in the world fitting into one bag, which had felt like poverty in St. Louis, and now felt like freedom, and looked around. Willow Creek was smaller than she had imagined. One main street. A general store, a saloon, a sheriff's office, a church at the far end with a white steeple that had seen better decades. People moved along the wooden boardwalks in the unhurried way of small-town life, and several of them had already stopped to look at the new arrivals stepping off the coach. Emma pulled her sleeve down. "Miss Collins," the voice came from her left. Low, even without any particular urgency in it. She turned, and her whole body did the thing it always did when an unfamiliar man addressed her shoulders coming up chin, dropping slightly weight, shifting to her back foot. Ready to make herself smaller, ready to run if smaller wasn't enough. The man standing a few feet away was tall. Not in a looming way, but in the straightforward way of someone who had grown up doing hard physical work. He held his hat in his hands and was turning it slowly between his fingers, which she would later understand was what Luke Harper did when he was thinking about how to say something carefully. "I'm Luke Harper," he said. "You'd be Emma Collins, I expect." "Yes," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. He nodded once. He did not move toward her. He did not reach for her bag. He just stood there at that respectful distance, turning his hat, and looked at her the way a person looks at something they are trying to understand, without startling. "Good journey?" he asked. "Long," she said. "They always are." He settled his hat back on his head. "Wagon's over here when you're ready. No rush." She had expected something different. She wasn't sure what exactly. An assessment may be the kind of slow, deliberate look that men gave women. They had purchased something from checking to confirm the merchandise matched the description. Victor had looked at her that way. So had the men he sometimes brought to dinner, the ones who spoke about her in the third person while she stood 5 feet away. "She's obedient enough. Quiet. Good-looking if you like them thin." Luke Harper looked at her the way you look at a person. It threw her completely off balance. She followed him to the wagon without speaking, and he loaded her carpet bag into the back without asking her to hand it over. Just waited until she set it down, and then lifted it up. Himself easy and unremarkable, like it was no particular thing. She climbed up onto the seat. He climbed up on the other side. He picked up the reins, and the horse, a steady gray mare with a white blaze on her forehead, started moving without being asked. They drove out of Willow Creek in silence. Emma kept her hands folded in her lap and watched the landscape. She had not seen land like this before. St. Louis was all brick and coal smoke, and the press of too many people in too little space. This was open in a way that made her chest ache, all rolling grassland and enormous sky. The mountains a dark line to the west that looked close enough to touch but never got any nearer. She understood sitting in that wagon that distances worked differently out here. "The ranch is about 4 miles out," Luke said after a while. "Nothing fancy, functional." "I don't need fancy," Emma said. He glanced at her. "No, I didn't reckon you did." Another silence. It was a comfortable silence, she realized with some surprise. Not the loaded kind she was used to, where silence meant Victor was building toward something, and the only question was, how long before it arrived? "I want to say something," Luke said. He kept his eyes on the road. "And I want you to hear it plain, without any other meaning behind it." Emma's hands tightened in her lap. "Here it is." "All right. I know this arrangement is unusual," he said. "And I know you came a long way, and I know that takes courage, whatever the reason was. I'm not going to ask you about the reason." He paused. "You've got your own room, your own door. There's no expectation and no deadline. You take whatever time you need to decide whether this is somewhere you want to stay. And if you decide it isn't, I'll put you on the next stage to wherever you want to go, and I won't say a word about it." Emma stared at the side of his face. He said it the same way he'd said everything else, flat and practical, like he was explaining how the well pump worked. Not like he was doing her a favor. Not like he expected anything in return. "Why?" she said. He thought about that for a moment. "Because that's how it ought to be," he said finally. "Seems simple enough to me." It was not simple. It was the most extraordinary thing anyone had said to her in as long as she could remember. But she didn't say that. She turned back to the open land and the enormous sky, and felt something shift behind her sternum, small and cautious, like an animal testing the air after a long time in hiding. She did not let herself trust it. Not yet. The ranch was exactly what he'd said. Functional. A main house built from timber and stone, a barn, a bunkhouse for the 3 ranch hands who worked the property, a kitchen garden running along the south wall. Clean, orderly, the kind of place that had been cared for over years with steady, unglamorous attention. Luke showed her through the house without ceremony. The kitchen, the sitting room, a small study lined with account books. And at the end of the hall, a door. "Your room," he said, and pushed it open. It was plain. A bed with a quilted coverlet, a washstand, a window that faced east. On the windowsill, someone had put a small jar of wildflowers, purple and yellow, freshly picked. She looked at the flowers for a long moment. "My neighbor's daughter put those there," Luke said from behind her. "She's 10. She heard a woman was coming and she wanted to make it nice." He sounded faintly embarrassed. "You can take them out if you'd rather." "No," Emma said. Her voice was strange. She cleared her throat. "They're lovely. There's food in the kitchen whenever you want it. No schedule." He stepped back from the doorway. "I'll let you rest." She heard his footsteps go down the hall. She stood in the room for a long moment, looking at the wildflowers, and then she crossed to the door and turned the latch. It locked from the inside. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed both hands flat on her knees and breathed. She had not had a locking door in 4 years. Since the winter, she turned 16, and Victor had decided that doors with locks were a form of defiance. She sat there for a long time. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the ranch, the distant voices of the hands, a horse moving in the corral, the wind in the grass. Normal sounds. Working sounds. Nothing coming down the hall. When she finally lay down on top of the quilted coverlet, still fully dressed, her boots still on, she told herself she would not sleep. She never slept easily in unfamiliar places. She would lie here and think and listen and be ready. She was asleep in 4 minutes. She woke to pale early light coming through the east window and the smell of coffee from somewhere down the hall. For exactly 1 second before memory assembled itself, she felt nothing. No fear. No bracing. Just the smell of coffee and the sound of birds. Then it all came back, and she sat up fast, heart already hammering. She made herself breathe. She was in Wyoming. She was in a locked room. She was not in St. Louis. She unlocked the door and went to the kitchen. Luke was already at the table with a cup of coffee and a ledger book open in front of him. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway, and he did not comment on the fact that she was still wearing yesterday's dress, or that her hair was half down, or that she looked like a person who had woken up swinging. "Coffee's on the stove," he said. "Cups are in the cabinet above." She poured herself a cup. She stood at the stove and drank it standing up because it felt safer than sitting with her back to the wall and a clear line to the door, and she waited for something to be wrong about this. Nothing was wrong about it. "I can help," she said abruptly, "with whatever needs doing. I can cook, and I can keep accounts. I told you that. I can work." "I know," he said. He turned a page in the ledger. "Appreciate it. I'm not—" She stopped, started again. "I'm not going to be a burden." He looked up at that. He had steady eyes. She noticed gray without much expression on the surface, but attentive in a way that was hard to describe. The way a person listens when they're actually listening, not just waiting for their turn to talk. "I know that too," he said. Nobody said anything about burdens. She looked down at her coffee cup. Her sleeve had ridden up slightly on her right arm, and she pulled it down, the motion quick and automatic, before she registered that he wasn't looking at her arm. He had already looked back at his ledger. "I'll start on breakfast," she said. "That'd be fine," he said. "Thank you." She moved to the kitchen and found everything in its logical place. Flour, salt, lard, a cast iron skillet hanging from a hook, and she began doing the thing she had always been best at, which was making order out of the raw materials in front of her. She was making biscuits before she realized her hands had stopped shaking. The days that followed had a shape to them. Up before dawn. Breakfast for Luke and the hands. Work through the morning cleaning, mending the kitchen garden. After the midday meal, the account books. This was the part she liked best. Numbers were honest. A column that didn't balance told you exactly where the error was. There was no guessing and no interpretation and no possibility of being wrong about what you saw. On the third day, Luke set the ranch ledgers in front of her without comment, and she went through 6 months of accounts in an afternoon and found 2 billing errors and 1 miscalculation that together amounted to nearly $40. She brought him the corrected figures after supper. He looked them over for a long time. "Where'd you learn to do this?" he said. "My father taught me," Emma said. "Before he died." He nodded. He did not ask how her father died, or how old she had been, or what came after. "These are good," he said. "Sharp work." She went back to her room and sat with her back against the locked door in the dark for a while, and she thought about her father's face, and the small, neat desk in their house in Ohio, where he had taught her ledger work on Sunday afternoons. And she let herself feel that grief the way she rarely did anymore. Quickly. Completely. And then she folded it back up and put it away. She was in Wyoming. She had locked doors and wildflowers and work that used her mind. That had to be enough. For now, it had to be enough. The town was harder than the ranch. The first time Luke took her into Willow Creek for supplies, she felt the eyes on her the way she always felt eyes, as a physical thing between her shoulder blades. People on the boardwalk noted her with the frank curiosity of a small community encountering something new. She caught fragments as they passed. Harper's mail-order bride. Heard she came from St. Louis. Awfully young. She kept her face forward and her hands still and did not let herself hurry. Hurrying looked like running, and running looked like guilt. And she had spent too many years having someone else's guilt laid over her like a coat she couldn't take off. At the general store, the owner, a heavy-set man named Dunning with a thick mustache, looked her over with the assessment she had been waiting for since the stagecoach. "Luke finally got himself a wife," he said to Luke, as though Emma were a piece of furniture he'd ordered from a catalog. "She look as good in working clothes as she does cleaned up." "She's standing right there, Herschel," Luke said. His voice did not change in tone or volume, but something in it settled like weight. Dunning blinked. "Just saying. I heard what you were saying." Luke set his list on the counter. "We'll need these things. Thank you." Emma looked at a shelf of canned goods and said nothing, because saying nothing was what she knew. But she was aware at the edge of her vision of Luke's stillness. Not the stillness of a man containing anger, but the stillness of a man who had already made a decision. Outside loading supplies into the wagon, she said, "You didn't have to do that." "He was rude," Luke said. "I'm used to rude," she said. He stopped what he was doing and looked at her. "That's a sad thing to be used to," he said. He picked up the next crate. "You shouldn't have to be." She didn't answer. She climbed up onto the wagon seat and looked at the distant mountains and thought about the difference between people who told you that you deserved better and people who, when the moment came, simply acted like it. That evening she went to bed knowing one thing she hadn't known the night before. Luke Harper did not just say what was right. He did it. Quietly, without ceremony, without requiring her to notice. She turned the latch on her door and lay in the dark and listened to the wind off the prairie and the safe, ordinary sounds of a sleeping house. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she thought about the future without feeling afraid. Not safe, not healed, not trusting, not yet. But something, some first thin thread of something she couldn't quite name, stitching itself quietly together in the dark. 2/2. The thread she had found in the dark did not disappear with morning. It stayed. Thin, uncertain, easy to lose track of, but there. Emma could feel it sometimes when she was working through the ledgers or standing at the stove before the rest of the house was awake or listening to the prairie wind come down off the mountains at night. Something that was not hope exactly, because hope was too big a word for what she had room for yet, but something adjacent to it. Something that kept her from bracing every time she heard footsteps in the hall. She did not stop being careful. Careful was not a choice she made. It was something her body did automatically, the way it pulled her sleeve down, or shifted her weight toward the nearest exit, or tracked the position of every person in a room. Those things did not stop, but they became quieter. Background noise instead of the only sound. She started letting herself learn the ranch. Not just the account books, though. Those became her territory in a way that felt increasingly like pride. Luke handed her the full set of ledgers by the end of her third week without fanfare, just set them on the table and said, "These are yours now if you want them." And she had wanted them badly enough that it surprised her. She organized the records going back 2 years. identified a pattern of overcharging from a grain supplier in Laramie, and wrote a letter careful factual with supporting figures that resulted in a credit of $63. When she showed Luke the reply, he read it twice, and then looked at her with an expression she couldn't immediately identify. "You wrote this yourself," he said. "Yes." "You didn't tell me you were doing it." "I wanted to be sure it would work before I said anything," she said, "in case it didn't." He set the letter down. "Emma," he said, and something in his voice made her go still. "You can tell me things that don't work. That's allowed." She looked at him for a moment. "I know," she said. She didn't know. Not yet. But she was starting to understand that he meant it. Beyond the ledgers, she learned the horses. This came slower. The ranch hands Tom, a weathered man in his 40s who said little and meant everything he said. Caleb, 23, and eager in the way of young men who want to prove something. And older Pete, who had been on this land longer than the main house. All three of them treated her with a careful, watchful courtesy that she recognized as Luke's influence. None of them pressed her. None of them commented on the way she startled at sudden sounds or stood with her back to walls. They simply worked around it the way experienced men work around weather. Tom was the one who taught her about the horses. "You're scared of them," he said one morning, not as a judgment, just as an observation, the same tone he used to note that the north fence needed mending. "A little," Emma admitted. "They know that," he said. "Come here." He spent 20 minutes showing her how to stand, where to put her hands, how to let the mare smell her before she reached for the neck. "She needs to know you're not a threat," he said. "After that, she needs to know you're steady. Horses don't trust nervous, they trust calm." Emma thought about that for days afterward. The way he'd said it, they trust calm, as though calm were something you could learn to perform well enough that it became real. She practiced. The mare's name was Clara. Within 2 weeks, Clara was eating from Emma's hand. Within a month, Emma could saddle her without help and ride the fence line at a slow walk, which Tom declared satisfactory, and Caleb declared impressive, and Pete said nothing about because Pete said nothing about most things. Luke watched all of this from a careful distance. She noticed that about him the way he stayed back. Not absent, not indifferent, but deliberately not pressing. He asked about her work when she brought it to him and answered her questions directly, and sat across the supper table 5 nights out of 7 and talked about the ranch, about the weather moving in from the west, about the price of cattle in Cheyenne. He did not ask about St. Louis. He did not ask about her family. He did not ask about the way she sometimes came to breakfast with shadows under her eyes that had nothing to do with the hour she'd risen. One evening she asked him why. They were sitting on the porch after supper, which had become a quiet habit. The sky was enormous and going orange and pink at the edges, and Emma had her hands around a coffee cup, and Luke had his hat on his knee. And they had been sitting in that comfortable silence long enough that speaking felt natural rather than intrusive. "Why don't you ask me things?" she said. He considered the question seriously, which was how he considered everything. "Because you'll tell me when you're ready," he said. "And because anything you tell me before you're ready isn't really yours to give." She looked at him. "That doesn't make sense," she said. "Sure it does," he said. "You've had enough people take things from you that weren't offered. I'm not going to do that." The silence after that was different from the silence before. Fuller somehow. Heavier in a way that was not uncomfortable. "How do you know something was taken?" she asked carefully. "I don't know anything," he said. "I observe. You can correct me if I'm wrong." She didn't correct him. She looked back at the orange sky and thought about the word observe and what it meant that a man could look at her and see what had happened without requiring her to say it out loud. Nobody had ever done that before. Victor had seen it and used it. Everyone else had simply not looked. She went to bed that night with that fullness still in her chest. And she lay in the dark and told herself firmly that gratitude was not the same as trust. And trust was not the same as safety. And safety was not something you decided about based on 6 weeks of evidence, no matter how consistent the evidence was. She believed all of that. She also knew something had shifted. She met Sarah Whitmore at the midweek church social that Luke drove her to in early August. Sarah was perhaps 50, lean and sharp-eyed, and wearing a widow's plain gray, and she walked directly across the churchyard to Emma within 30 seconds of their arrival, with the air of a woman who had decided something and wasn't interested in delaying it. "You'll be Luke's Emma," Sarah said. "I'm Sarah Whitmore. I've lived here 11 years, and I know everything that happens in this town, and most of what happens outside it. And I want you to know that Luke Harper is the best man in this county, and if anyone gives you trouble, you can send them to me." She paused. "I heard Herschel Dunning was rude to you at the store." Emma blinked. "Word travels fast. Word always travels fast. Herschel is a fool, and everyone knows it." Sarah took her arm with the familiarity of a woman who had decided they were already friends. "Come meet Hannah. She teaches at the school, and she's far too young to be as sensible as she is." Hannah Brooks was perhaps 25, with ink-stained fingers and a quick laugh, and she shook Emma's hand like a man and said, "I heard you corrected the Laramie grain account. $63 is nothing to sniff at." Emma stared. "How does everyone know that?" "Tom mentioned it to Pete. Pete mentioned it to his wife Margaret. Margaret mentioned it at the dry goods store." Hannah shrugged. "Small-town arithmetic. Get used to it." "Does nothing stay private?" "Absolutely not," Sarah said cheerfully. "But the good news is, news of you being clever travels just as fast as news of anything else. Reputation moves quick out here. You've already got a good one." Emma had not had a good reputation anywhere. In St. Louis, Victor had ensured that the only things people knew about her were the things he wanted them to know: that she was difficult, unstable, ungrateful for his care. It had been part of the trap. By the time she might have reached out to someone for help, she was already certain they wouldn't believe her. She thought about that on the drive back to the ranch, watching the last of the sunset bleed out behind the mountains. "Sarah Whitmore is a force of nature," she said. Luke almost smiled. "Yes, she is. She told me I should come to her with any trouble." "She means that," he said. "She runs half this county on the strength of sheer will and the other half on kindness. She'll outlive all of us." Emma turned that over. "Is that what community looks like?" she said. "Out here?" He thought about it. "At its best," he said. "Yeah, that's what it looks like." She had never had community. She'd had Victor's controlled circle, people he approved of, who owed him something, who looked at Emma with the particular blank courtesy of people carefully not seeing what they didn't want to deal with. This was different. These people were sharp-eyed and curious, and entirely willing to see her, and that was terrifying in a way. That was also, she was beginning to understand the first sign that something might actually be safe. The heat broke in early September, and the work shifted. Haying was finished. Now came fence repair before winter sorting and moving cattle, beginning the preparations that defined the rhythm of ranch life in the months before the first hard frost. Emma worked alongside everyone else, and her body, which had been thin and careful when she arrived, began changing under the demands of physical labor. Stronger, more certain. She started waking up without the immediate slam of fear, and sometimes she was halfway through breakfast before the habit caught up with her. One morning she dropped a coffee cup on the kitchen floor, and it shattered, and she had her back against the counter before the sound had finished echoing. Both hands braced on the countertop, whole body rigid. Tom and Caleb were at the table. Neither of them moved or spoke for a moment. Then Caleb leaned over and picked up the largest piece of broken cup and set it on the table and said in a voice that was so carefully normal it was almost funny, "I did the same thing last week." Pete said the handle was already cracked. Tom nodded without looking up from his plate. "Handle was cracked," he confirmed. Emma's breathing slowed. She looked at the broken cup. She crouched down and began picking up the smaller pieces, and by the time she had them all in her hand, she was no longer shaking. She was grateful for those men in a way she never figured out how to say. It was a bright afternoon in the second week of September when it happened. She was carrying feed sacks from the barn to the storage building, heavy work, but she had been doing it for weeks, and had found the rhythm of it, the way you shift the weight onto your shoulders and let your legs do the work. She was on her third trip, moving quickly because clouds were building to the west, and she wanted to finish before rain, and she bent to lift the last sack and something went wrong. Not in the sack, in her side. The bruise on her ribs, the worst one, the one that had never fully healed, caught under the pressure and sent a bolt of pain up through her chest, sharp enough to buckle her knees. She was falling before she understood she was falling, the sack going sideways, her hands reaching for nothing. She didn't hit the ground. Two hands caught her, one at her arm and one at her back, solid and immediate, and she was held upright so fast she barely registered the fall. She straightened, gasping, and Luke was right there. He had been coming across the yard. She hadn't heard him, and his face was doing something complicated that resolved quickly into the careful nothing he wore when he was controlling a reaction. His hand was still on her arm. She became aware of this at the same moment he did, and he released her immediately, one step back, hands open. "I've got you," he said. "You're all right." She was trying to breathe around the pain in her side. It was bad. She had been managing it for weeks, but the fall had done something, and now it was bad, and she was standing in the middle of the yard with tears stinging the back of her eyes from pure pain. And she could not do this right now. She could not. "Emma." His voice was quiet. "Look at me." She looked at him. "Your sleeve," he said. She looked down. When he had caught her, his grip on her arm had pulled her sleeve up. The bruise was there, all of it, the full dark sprawl of it from her wrist to above her elbow. Weeks old, but still deep, the kind of bruise that sits in the tissue and refuses to leave. The yard was completely still. Luke was looking at the bruise. She watched his face move through something recognition, then a carefully controlled anger, then something quieter and more serious than either. He did not say anything for a long moment. When he finally looked up at her, his eyes were gray and steady and full of something she hadn't seen directed at her before. Not pity, something closer to grief. "Emma," he said. He stopped, started again. "Who did this to you?" The question was so simple. She had heard variations of it in her head for years, imagined someone asking. Imagined what she would say. Imagined the relief of saying it, and the disaster that relief would bring. Victor had told her many times what happened to women who told. He'd told her no one would believe her. He'd told her she owed him everything, her life, the food in her stomach, the roof over her head, and that any woman with sense understood that debts like that were paid without complaint. She had believed him for a long time, because he had been all she had, and people believe what they need to believe to survive. But she was standing in Wyoming. She had a locking door. She had $63 recovered from a Laramie grain supplier. She had Sarah Whitmore's arm through hers, and Hannah Brooks' ink-stained handshake, and Tom's deliberate calm, and Caleb's careful voice saying the handle was already cracked, and a gray mare named Clara, who had decided she was steady enough to trust. She opened her mouth. "His name is Victor Collins," she said. "He's my uncle, and he's been doing this since I was 16 years old." The words came out flat and clear, nothing like the way she had imagined saying them. Not weeping, not desperate, just true. Luke stood with his hands open at his sides and listened, and his face did not change into disbelief or calculation, or the particular retreating expression of a person deciding something is not their problem. It stayed exactly as it was, present and serious, and full of that quiet grief, and that steadiness was the thing that kept her talking. She told him about her parents, about Ohio, about coming to St. Louis at 12 years old with a trunk and a grief so large she hadn't known how to carry it, and Victor meeting her at the station with his suit and his reasonable smile. About how it had started small at first, the way those things always start, so small you tell yourself you're imagining it. About the years that followed, the doors, the isolation, the inventory of reasons. She talked until her voice was rough, and the clouds to the west had rolled in, and the first drops of rain were beginning to fall, and when she finally stopped, Luke was still standing exactly where he had been, hands open, listening. The rain came down harder. Neither of them moved. "Come inside," he said finally, his voice rougher than usual. She followed him in. He put coffee on the stove. She sat at the kitchen table, with her hands flat on the surface, the way she'd sat that first morning. And outside, the rain fell hard and straight, and the thunder rolled down off the mountains, and she felt against all reasonable expectation, not smaller for having said it. Larger somehow. Like something that had been compressed for years had finally been allowed to expand to its actual size. Luke set a cup in front of her and sat down across the table and looked at her steadily. "I need you to know something," he said. "And I need you to believe it, not just hear it." She looked at him. "Whatever he told you about yourself," Luke said, "was wrong. All of it. Whatever reason he gave you for what he did, it was a lie he told because that's what men like that do." He paused. "You don't owe me anything for saying that. I'm saying it because it's true." Emma looked down at her coffee cup. She had heard the words before in her own head in the small private arguments she'd had with Victor's voice when she was alone. But hearing them from outside, plainly without drama in Luke Harper's matter-of-fact voice, was different in a way she wasn't prepared for. Her hands were shaking. "I know," she said. And this time she meant it. Outside, the rain drummed on the roof of the house she was beginning cautiously to think of as hers, and the thunder moved east, and Emma Collins sat at the kitchen table of a Wyoming ranch with her hands around a coffee cup, and the truth finally out of her body, and she breathed, and slowly the shaking stopped. The shaking stopped that night, but the fear did not. Emma understood the difference now. Fear was not the same as weakness. She had spent years believing Victor. When he told her, it was believing that her terror was evidence of some fundamental flaw in her character. Proof that she was exactly as small and useless as he said. But sitting in that kitchen in the aftermath of telling the truth with the rain still coming down, and Luke across the table, and the words finally out of her body and into the world, she understood that the fear was just information. It was her body remembering accurately. It was the part of her that had kept her alive all those years, still doing its job. She could be afraid and still be standing. That was new. The days after the rain had a different quality. Not easier exactly, but cleaner, like a room where someone had finally opened the windows. Emma moved through the work of the ranch with the same steadiness she had been building for months, but something underneath it had changed, a loosening deep and slow like a knot that has been worked at so long it finally gives. Luke did not bring up what she had told him again. He did not treat her differently, which was the thing she had been most afraid of, that saying it out loud would turn her into something that needed handling. He still handed her the ledgers in the morning. He still asked her opinion on the grain order and the fence repair schedule, and whether she thought the north pasture could support another 20 head through winter. He still sat on the porch in the evenings and talked about nothing in particular, in that easy, unhurried way he had, and he still turned his hat in his hands when he was thinking carefully about something. The only difference was that sometimes now he looked at her directly when he said her name. And she let him. Sarah Whitmore came out to the ranch on a Thursday morning, 3 days after the rain, driving her own wagon, with the confidence of a woman who had been navigating frontier roads for over a decade. She tied the horse at the post, came through the kitchen door without knocking, a familiarity Emma was learning to read as warmth rather than intrusion, and sat down at the table and looked at Emma with those sharp, knowing eyes. "You told him," Sarah said. Emma stopped measuring flour. "Did he tell you?" "No," Sarah said. "Luke Harper doesn't tell anyone anything that isn't his to tell. I can just see it on you." She folded her hands on the table. "You look different. Less like someone waiting for the floor to drop." Emma set the measuring cup down. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who's been watching." Sarah paused. "I know something about carrying things you didn't earn," she said. "My first husband was not a kind man. I left him when I was 26, and everyone in my hometown told me I was making a mistake." Her voice was even, matter of fact. "I came west because I needed to go somewhere nobody knew what they'd said about me." Emma looked at her. "I'm telling you this," Sarah said, because I want you to know that what you're doing, getting back up, building something, it's not small. Even when it feels like just getting through a day, it is not small." Emma turned back to the flower because she needed something to do with her hands. "I'm not sure I'm building anything yet," she said. "I'm mostly just staying." "Staying is building," Sarah said firmly. "Don't let anyone tell you different." The frost came in the third week of October, and with it, the hard shift into winter preparation that consumed every hour of daylight. Emma worked until her hands were rough and her shoulders ached, and she discovered that physical exhaustion was different from the exhaustion of fear. Fear wore you down to something hollow. Work wore you down to something solid. She went to bed tired in her bones and slept without hearing footsteps. She and Hannah Brooks had fallen into an easy habit of meeting on Saturday afternoons. When weather permitted, Hannah would drive out from town or Emma would ride Clara in, and they would sit in Sarah's kitchen or at the school after the children had gone and talk about everything and nothing. Hannah was sharp and funny and said exactly what she thought, which Emma found both alarming and deeply refreshing. "Can I ask you something personal?" Hannah said one Saturday in late October, her fingers wrapped around a teacup. "You can ask," Emma said. "Do you love him?" Emma went very still. "Luke," Hannah clarified, as though there were any question. "I know it's not my business, but I've seen the way he looks at you when you're not watching, and I've seen the way you look at him when you think nobody's watching, and I'm a school teacher, so I'm professionally obligated to address things people are pretending not to notice." Emma looked at her tea. "It's complicated," she said. "Love usually is," Hannah said. "That's not an answer, though." "I trust him," Emma said slowly. "I didn't think I would. I didn't think I could after—" She stopped. "I trust him. And when I try to imagine not being there at the ranch, it feels wrong in a way that has nothing to do with practicality." She looked up. "Is that the same thing?" Hannah considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "I think," she said, "that for someone who's been through what you've been through, trust might be the most profound form of love there is." Emma drove back to the ranch in the late afternoon, with those words sitting in her chest, turning them over carefully, the way you turn something fragile that you're not yet sure will hold its shape. She had not told Hannah what she'd told Luke. But somehow Hannah knew enough and had offered understanding without requiring the full account, and that was its own kind of grace. November arrived cold and fast. The ranch contracted inward the way it did every winter. More time inside work. Closer to the buildings, the rhythms slower and more deliberate. Emma had the ledgers current through the end of the fiscal year, had negotiated a new supply contract with a Cheyenne merchant that saved the ranch 14% on winter goods, and had begun keeping a second set of books tracking cattle weight and feed consumption ratios that Tom called unnecessary, and Pete called smart, and Caleb called something he didn't understand but looked impressive. Luke looked at those books for a long time one evening. "Where'd you learn to think like this?" he said. "I didn't learn it," Emma said. "I just see the patterns. I always have." He looked at her over the top of the ledger. "You could do this professionally," he said. "Not ranch accounts, business accounts, bank accounts. You could do this for the whole county if you wanted to." She hadn't thought about that. She thought about it now, and the shape of it, of having work that was entirely hers, that existed independent of any arrangement or obligation, settled into her mind with a quiet, solid weight. "Maybe," she said. "Not maybe," he said. "You're good at this, Emma. Better than most men I know who do it for a living. That's not nothing." She looked down at the columns of figures. Her figures. Her neat, honest numbers that told the truth whether she wanted them to or not. "Thank you," she said. She meant it for more than the compliment. He nodded once and went back to reading, and that was enough. With Luke, that was always enough. He didn't need her to perform gratitude or explain herself or justify the space she took up. He just said the true thing and let it land and trusted her to know what to do with it. She was falling in love with him. She knew that now. It terrified her in a way that was entirely different from Victor's terror, not the fear of pain, but the fear of losing something real. The fear that came with having something to lose. She was still sitting with that when the letter arrived. It came on a Tuesday in the second week of November, addressed to the ranch in a hand she recognized before she finished reading the name on the envelope. Her whole body knew it before her mind caught up the familiar locking of her spine, the sudden shallow quality of her breathing, the automatic reach toward her sleeve. Victor's handwriting, on a letter addressed to Harper Ranch, Willow Creek, Wyoming Territory. She was alone in the kitchen. She set the letter on the table and stood 3 feet from it for a long moment, as though it might do something. Then she picked it up and opened it. He was brief. Victor was always brief in writing. He preferred to do his damage in person, where volume and proximity did most of the work. But the words on the page were enough. He knew where she was. He had hired someone to find her, which told her he had money enough for that which meant the accounting job she had left behind, the one she'd done for 2 years under his supervision, quietly, competently, without credit, had been worth more to him than she had understood. He was coming to collect what was his. He expected her to be prepared to return to St. Louis. He reminded her in the particular careful language he used for this purpose that she was not legally married, that a mail-order arrangement carried no binding contract, that a 20-year-old woman with no family and no documented history could find herself in very difficult circumstances if she were uncooperative. The letter ended with her name. Just her name in his handwriting. She sat with it in her lap for a long time. Then she got up, walked down the hall, and knocked on the door of Luke's study. "Come in," he said. She opened the door and held out the letter. "He found me," she said. Luke's face did not change expression. He took the letter, read it. She watched his jaw tighten once and release. He read it again. Then he set it on the desk and looked at her, and his voice when he spoke was completely level. "You're not going back," he said. "No," she said. "I'm not. Then we deal with this here." He stood up. "I'm going to talk to Sheriff Alderman in the morning. I want to know what legal standing he has coming into this territory and what options we have." He paused. "Sarah knows people in Cheyenne, a lawyer. We should talk to her." Emma was watching him move through this the way she watched him handle everything direct, methodical, without panic. "You're not asking me if I'm sure," she said. He looked at her. "Are you not sure?" "I'm sure," she said. "I've been sure since the day I left. I'm just—" She stopped. "I thought I had more time." "You have all the time you need," he said. "He's not here yet, and when he gets here, you won't be standing alone." Something cracked open in her chest. Not painfully the way something opens when it's finally ready, when the pressure has built long enough that release is pure relief. "Luke," she said. He looked at her and waited. "I don't want to just be staying anymore," she said. He went very still. "I want to—" She steadied herself. "I want to stay because I'm choosing to, not because I'm hiding, not because I don't have anywhere else, because this is mine and I'm choosing it." She looked at him directly the way she had been learning to do. "If that's something you still want." The silence lasted exactly long enough to feel significant. "Emma Collins," he said, and his voice was rough in a way she had never heard before. "It is the only thing I've wanted since the day you stepped off that stagecoach and looked at me like you were ready to fight the whole world with your hands if you had to." She let out a breath that felt like it had been held for years. He crossed the room and took her hands. Both of them carefully, and she let him in her hands did not shake, and he looked at her in the way he looked at things he was trying to understand without startling. And he said, "We'll handle Victor Collins together, and then we'll build something that belongs to both of us." "Yes," she said. Outside, the November wind hit the side of the house and the timbers creaked and the fire in the study snapped, and she stood in the lamplight with her hands in his and felt something she barely had a name for settling all the way down into her bones. Not the absence of fear. Something larger than that. Something that took up space and had weight and edges. She was here. She had chosen to be here. And whatever was coming down the road from St. Louis, she was not the terrified girl in the stagecoach anymore. Victor Collins had no idea what was waiting for him in Willow Creek. He had no idea who Emma had become. Victor Collins arrived on a Friday. Emma knew before anyone told her. She was in the kitchen running figures on the Cheyenne supply contract when she heard hoofbeats on the road that were wrong. Not the familiar rhythm of a ranch horse or a neighbor's wagon, but the deliberate pace of someone who had traveled a long distance and was not hurrying now because he believed he had already won. Her pencil stopped moving. Her body knew that sound the way it knew cold. She set the pencil down and stood up. Tom appeared in the kitchen doorway 30 seconds later. His face was doing the careful nothing that meant something serious. "Man riding in from the East Road," he said. "Suit, no ranch gear, asking for you by name at the gate." "I know," Emma said. Tom looked at her steadily. "You want me to send him off?" "No." She straightened her spine one vertebra at a time. "I want you to let him come." Something moved in Tom's expression. Not surprise exactly, more like recognition. "Luke's in the barn," he said. "I know that too," Emma said. "Let him come, Tom." She had been preparing for this for 3 weeks. Not in the way Victor would have prepared, not with schemes and legal threats, and the particular weaponized patience of a man who believed time always worked in his favor. She had prepared the way she had learned to prepare for everything since coming to Wyoming, which was with information and documentation, and the clear-eyed accounting of exactly what she had, and exactly what she could prove. Sarah's lawyer in Cheyenne, a man named Gerald Fitch, who Sarah described as relentless, and Hannah described as terrifying in the best possible way, had responded to their letter within a week. He confirmed what Sheriff Alderman had already told Luke: a mail-order arrangement in Wyoming territory carried legal weight, particularly when the woman in question was of age and had entered it willingly and could demonstrate residency. Victor Collins had no legal authority over a 20-year-old woman who had left his household of her own accord. He had no contract. He had no guardianship claim that had not expired when Emma turned 18. What he had Fitch wrote carefully was a pattern of behavior that, if documented, constituted criminal assault across multiple jurisdictions. Emma had read that letter 4 times. Then she had sat down and written everything: dates, incidents, locations. The particular clarity of an accountant's mind applied to the inventory of what had been done to her, and when and where, with enough detail and internal consistency that Fitch had written back, saying it was the clearest account of its kind he had ever received, and he intended to use it. She had that document. She had a copy in the ranch safe, and a copy with Fitch in Cheyenne, and a copy with Sheriff Alderman in Willow Creek. Victor Collins was riding into a town where every significant authority figure already knew his name and what he had done. He did not know that yet. She heard him tie his horse at the post. She heard his boots on the porch steps, that particular heavy, unhurried tread she had spent years listening for in the dark. Her heart was slamming against her ribs, and her hands wanted to shake, and she pressed them flat against the kitchen table and breathed. She was not 16. She was not alone. And she was not afraid of him in the same way anymore. The knock on the door was 3 sharp raps. Victor's knock. She had always hated it. She crossed the kitchen and opened the door. He looked exactly the same. That was the first thing she registered with a strange, distant clarity. Same broad build, same dark suit that cost more than most men in Willow Creek made in a month, same way of standing that took up too much space on purpose. His face had not changed. The eyes had not changed that pale assessing look that inventoried everything it landed on and assigned a value. They landed on her now, and she watched him recalibrate. She had changed. She knew that from the outside as well as the inside. She stood differently. Her shoulders were back, and her chin was level, and her hands were still, and she was looking directly at him in a way she had not been able to do for years. Something shifted in his face. The certainty adjusted slightly, not gone, not yet, but recalculated. "Emma," he said. His voice was the same too, warm on the surface, nothing underneath it. "Victor," she said. He waited for her to step back from the door. She didn't. "You're going to invite me in," he said. "We have things to discuss." "We can discuss them here," she said. His eyes moved past her into the kitchen cataloging. "I've come a long way," he said. "I think the least you can do is offer a man a chair." I don't think I owe you the least of anything, Emma said. Say what you came to say. Something hardened in his face very briefly before the warmth reasserted itself. She had seen that flicker 1,000 times. She knew exactly what it meant, and exactly what usually came after it, and her body registered the warning the way it always had. The cold drop in her stomach, the instinct to apologize, to smooth things over, to do whatever made the flicker go away. She held the door and held her ground. You've been here too long, Victor said. You've gotten confused about some things. I understand that. I'm willing to overlook it. He paused, letting that land, the generosity of it, the magnanimity. This was his particular talent, framing cruelty as kindness. Come home, Emma. We'll say no more about it. I am home, she said. This... He let a small dismissive sound into his voice. This is a ranch hand's arrangement in a territory town. You belong in St. Louis. You have a life there. I had a room with a door that didn't lock, she said. That's not a life. The warmth drained. It went fast when he let it. She had seen that too, the speed of it, the way the reasonable man dissolved when the reasonable man stopped being useful. You will lower your voice, he said. I'm speaking at a perfectly normal volume, she said. I've been speaking at a perfectly normal volume this whole conversation. You just don't like what I'm saying. He stepped forward. Not far, just the fraction that was always the first move, the physical reminder of the difference in their sizes, the thing that had always worked. Emma's body registered it and sent the old signal, step back, shrink, give him the space he's claiming. She didn't move. Emma. His voice dropped into the register that had preceded most of the worst things. Quiet, deliberate. Don't make this difficult. Victor. Luke's voice came from behind him, level and carrying clearly across the yard. Victor turned. Luke had come from the barn. He was still wearing his work coat, and he stopped at a reasonable distance, and he did not raise his voice or change his expression. He just stood there with the solid, unhurried presence of a man entirely confident in his own ground. This is private family business, Victor said. No, Luke said. It isn't. I'm speaking to my niece. Your niece is a grown woman who has told you she is home, Luke said. She's told you everything that needs to be said. There's nothing left for you here. Victor looked between them, with the calculating look of a man sorting options. He turned back to Emma. You think this cowboy can protect you, he said. And he let a thread of contempt into the word cowboy, the particular contempt of a city man for men who worked with their hands. He has no legal claim on you. A letter in the mail is not a marriage. I could take you back today, and there isn't a court in this territory that would stop me. Emma looked at him. She let herself see him clearly. Not the enormous shadow that had filled every room for 8 years. Not the voice that had told her who she was, until she believed it. Just a man. A specific, limited, frightened man, who had needed to own something smaller than himself to feel large. Gerald Fitch disagrees, she said. Victor went still. He's a lawyer in Cheyenne, Emma said. He received a detailed account of every incident between us from the time I was 16 until the night I left St. Louis. Dates, locations, specifics. He found it very thorough. She paused. He's already been in contact with a judge in Missouri about several matters that apparently predate me. Things you did before I came to live with you that I didn't know about when I wrote my account, but that a thorough lawyer tends to uncover when he starts looking. The color in Victor's face shifted in a way she recognized, not the quick red of anger, but the slow gray of something going cold. You have no proof of anything, he said. I have a 12-page document witnessed and filed with the Laramie County Court, Emma said. Sheriff Alderman has a copy. Gerald Fitch has a copy. There's another one in a safe on this property. She held his gaze. You rode a long way for nothing, Victor. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes, the options running out one by one, each door closing. Then he looked at Luke, then back at Emma. You think you're clever, he said. I think I'm accurate, she said. There's a difference, but the outcome is the same. He took one step toward her. It was not much of a step. It was enough. The sound of a rifle being cocked is distinctive. Emma had learned that on the ranch, it has a specificity that no other sound quite matches a mechanical clarity that communicates without ambiguity. The sound came from her left. She glanced over. Tom was standing 10 feet away, with a Winchester leveled at a point roughly between Victor Collins and the horizon. "Sir," Tom said, "I'd reconsider that direction." Caleb was behind Victor, having come around the side of the house so quietly that neither Victor nor Emma had heard him. Pete stood at the barn door. Sheriff Alderman, who Luke had asked 3 days ago to be available on Friday, stepped off his horse at the gate with the unhurried movement of a man who has arrived at exactly the right moment. Victor turned full circle and looked at each of them. The calculation ran fast and came up empty. Emma watched it happen. She watched the moment when he understood that this was not the arrangement he had traveled across 4 states expecting to find. She had done that. She had built that. Not with her fists, not with rage, with 12 pages of careful documentation and a lawyer who was good at his job and a community that had decided she was one of theirs. She reached behind the door and picked up the rifle that she had leaned there before he arrived. She had practiced with it for 3 weeks. Tom had taught her patient and methodical the same way he had taught her about the horses. She raised it, settled the stock against her shoulder, and leveled it at Victor Collins's center mass. Her hands did not shake. "Get off this property," she said. "Don't come back. Don't write. Don't send anyone. The next communication you have with me will be through Gerald Fitch in Cheyenne, and I promise you, Victor, that is not a conversation you want to have." He stared at the barrel of the rifle. He stared at her face behind it. "Emma." "Get off my property," she said. He went. She held the rifle level until she heard him mount his horse, and she heard the hoofbeats going back down the east road, and she kept holding it until the sound was gone completely. And then Tom stepped forward and quietly took the rifle from her hands because her arms had started to shake, and she was not sure she could have lowered it herself. She stood in the yard and her whole body shook. Not from fear. From the release of something that had been held at tremendous tension for 8 years, finally letting go all at once. Luke was beside her, not touching her waiting hands open. "He's gone," she said. "He's gone," Luke confirmed. Sheriff Alderman came through the gate. He was a compact, quiet man with steady eyes not unlike Luke's. He looked at Emma with something like respect. "Miss Collins," he said, "I'm going to need that statement for our records. Formal this time." He paused. "Fitch's paperwork came through this morning. There's a warrant outstanding in Missouri. He won't be coming back." Emma heard that sentence and had to process it twice. He won't be coming back. "All right," she said. Her voice was steady. Alderman nodded, touched his hat, went back to his horse. Tom had carried the rifle back to its place beside the door. Caleb had disappeared around the side of the house and came back with a look of considerable satisfaction that he was trying and failing to suppress. Pete went back to the barn without comment, which was how Pete acknowledged most significant events. Sarah arrived 20 minutes later. She had been waiting at the crossroads which Emma had not known and found so deeply characteristic that she laughed, and the laugh came out wrong, too close to something else. And Sarah crossed the yard and took Emma in her arms and held her with the uncomplicated certainty of someone who had decided a long time ago that this young woman deserved to be held, and Emma let her. She cried. Not the crying she had done in private for years, quiet, controlled, nothing that would make noise. She cried the way she hadn't let herself since Ohio, since her father's hand on her shoulder at her mother's grave, since a time before she had learned to be small. It was ugly and honest, and it lasted a while, and when it was finished, she felt emptied out in the best possible way. "Done," Sarah said without judgment. "I think so," Emma said. "Good," Sarah said. "Then we're going inside, and I'm making coffee, and you are going to sit at that table and let people bring things to you for approximately 1 hour before you start being competent again." Emma laughed again, and this time it came out right. Later, when the kitchen was full of people, Sarah and Hannah, Tom and Caleb and Pete at the edges, in the way of men who are participating without appearing to Luke at the table with his coffee cup and his steady presence. Emma sat in the middle of it and felt the particular quality of the room settle around her. This was hers. These people. This kitchen. This table where she had run the accounts of a ranch she was learning to think of as home. The locked door at the end of the hall, and the gray mare named Clara, and the wildflowers in the jar on the windowsill, that had been replaced twice now, still brought by the same 10-year-old neighbor girl. Luke looked at her from across the table, and she looked back, and there was a whole conversation in that clear and complete, requiring no words. After everyone had gone and the kitchen was quiet, Emma went to the safe in the study. She took out her copy of the 12-page document, her own words, her own handwriting, her own careful inventory of the truth, and she held it for a moment. Then she put it back in the safe, closed it, and turned the lock. She didn't need to carry it in her body anymore. It was documented. It was witnessed. It lived on paper now in the right hands, in the right places. She was done carrying it alone. She walked down the hall and knocked on the door of the study, where Luke was finishing the evening accounts. And when he said, "Come in," she opened the door and said without preamble, "I'd like to discuss the marriage." He looked up, set his pencil down. "I'd like it to be real," she said. "Legal, formal, in the church at the end of the main street with Sarah as witness and Hannah arguing about the flowers." She paused. "If you're still of the same mind as 3 weeks ago." He stood up. He crossed the room. He took her face in both hands with the same careful deliberateness he applied to everything, and he looked at her the way he had looked at her that first day, like someone trying to understand something without startling it. "Emma Collins," he said, "I have been of the same mind since the day you corrected the Laramie grain account, and didn't tell me until you were certain it would hold." She put her hands over his and held them there. "Then we have a wedding to plan," she said. Outside, the wind came off the mountains clean and cold, and the stars over Wyoming were extraordinary. And inside the study of a ranch house at the edge of a frontier county, 2 people stood in the lamplight making a quiet, permanent choice. They were married on the 2nd Saturday of December in the church at the end of Willow Creek's main street, with snow coming down outside in the quiet, purposeful way of early winter storms that intend to stay. Sarah Whitmore stood as witness and cried without apology. Hannah Brooks had in fact argued about the flowers. There were none to be had in December, and she had driven to 3 different ranches, looking for dried lavender, and come back triumphant with a bundle that she arranged herself and defended from any criticism with the ferocity of someone who understood that the details mattered. Tom and Caleb and Pete sat in the front pew in their best clothes, Pete's collar visibly uncomfortable, Caleb's boots recently and imperfectly polished. Sheriff Alderman came. The neighbor girl who had put wildflowers on the windowsill that first day came with her mother and sat in the back and watched everything with enormous eyes. The ceremony was short. The pastor spoke about covenant and trust and building things that last, and Emma stood in her best dress, dark blue wool, the nicest thing she owned, and held Luke's hands and looked at his face and thought about the word covenant. The old meaning of it. A promise made between 2 people who understood what they were promising. She had not believed for most of her life that promises meant anything. Victor had made promises. The world was full of men who made promises with their mouths while their hands were doing something else entirely. But Luke Harper had never made a promise he didn't keep. She knew that now, not from hoping, but from watching month after careful month. He had told her she owed him nothing and then asked for nothing. He had told her the kindness wasn't temporary, and it hadn't been. He had told her that when Victor came, she wouldn't stand alone, and she hadn't. When the pastor said the words, and Luke said, "I do." In his steady, plain voice, Emma said it back and meant it down to the floor. Outside, the snow was still falling. Sarah threw dried lavender because Hannah had thought ahead to bring some. Pete shook Luke's hand. Caleb shook it too, and then looked at Emma and shook hers as well, with a formality that was so deliberate and so sincere that she had to look away for a moment. They drove back to the ranch in the early afternoon with the snow coming down around them, and the gray mare, Clara, tossed her head in the cold air, and Emma sat beside her husband, with her shoulder against his arm, and thought, "This is real. This is a real thing that happened. I made this." The winter settled in around them, and the ranch closed into its cold weather rhythms, and Emma moved through those rhythms now as a full partner in a way that had nothing to do with obligation. She and Luke reviewed the books together each evening. She had taken on 2 additional clients by January: the general store and the feed merchant, both of whose accounts had been kept in ways that were charitable to describe as inconsistent, and word was spreading in the county that Emma Harper had a gift for financial order that was worth paying for. Gerald Fitch wrote in February to inform them that Victor Collins had been arrested in Missouri on charges predating Emma entirely. 2 other women, a pattern that went back further than she had known. The letter was factual and brief, and Emma read it standing at the kitchen table with coffee going cold at her elbow. And she thought about those other women, their names. She didn't know their faces. She couldn't picture. And she felt a complicated grief for all of them, and a quiet, hard satisfaction that Fitch had found what he'd gone looking for. She wrote back and asked if there was anything further she could provide. Fitch said no. The case was complete. She filed the letter in the safe beside the 12-page document and closed the door and went back to the kitchen and finished her coffee, and then went to work, because that was what you did with the things that were finished. You put them away in the right place and you kept going. Spring came. The way spring came, in Wyoming, abruptly, like a decision. The cold breaking almost overnight, and the grasslands coming up green faster than seemed possible. Emma had been through one winter on the ranch and came out the other side knowing things about herself she hadn't when she went in. She knew she could work in brutal cold without losing her nerve. She knew she could manage the accounts of 3 businesses simultaneously and keep them clean. She knew she could ride Clara at a full gallop along the north fence line and feel nothing but the speed and the wind. She also knew she was pregnant. She told Luke on a Tuesday evening in early April, sitting on the porch with coffee cups, because the porch evenings had never stopped even in winter, when they lasted approximately 4 minutes before the cold drove them inside. She said it plainly, the way she said everything now, because she had spent enough years not saying things plainly, and it had cost her too much. "I'm going to have a baby," she said. Luke went very still in the particular way that meant he was experiencing something large and managing it with care. Then he set his coffee cup down and looked at her, and his face did something she had only seen a handful of times. The careful nothing dropped completely all the way, and what was underneath it was so unguarded and real that she felt her own throat tighten. "Emma," he said. "I know," she said. "Are you—" He stopped. "How are you feeling about it?" She thought about that question honestly because it deserved honesty. She felt terrified. She felt unprepared in ways she hadn't finished cataloging. She felt a love so immediate and protective for the thing that was not yet a person that it had knocked her sideways the moment she understood it was there. She felt the old shadow of Victor's voice, saying she was not capable of anything real, and she felt herself dismiss it with a speed and finality that would have astonished the girl on the stagecoach. "I feel ready," she said. "I didn't expect to, but I do." He reached over and took her hand and held it the way he had in the study the night they decided to marry, steady and deliberate and certain. "We're going to be good at this," he said. "Yes," she said. "We are." Sarah's reaction was loud enough to be heard across the yard. Hannah arrived the next day with a book about infant care that she had ordered from a bookseller in Chicago, and presented with the energy of someone who had been waiting for an excuse to do exactly this. Tom said nothing, which meant he was pleased. Caleb said congratulations approximately 6 times in one conversation, and then appeared embarrassed by this, and went to fix a fence that did not need fixing. The pregnancy changed the rhythm of the ranch again, and Emma adapted to each change with the practical flexibility that had become her defining characteristic. She kept the accounts. She kept riding Clara until her body made it impractical, at which point she shifted to a gentler horse without drama. She built a network of clients that by midsummer included the bank, 2 cattle operations, and a mining concern east of the county line. And she conducted business by letter and by appointment with the steady authority of someone who understood that her expertise had value independent of her name or her age or her gender. There were men who did not take her seriously. This happened less often than she had expected, and when it did, she let the numbers speak. Numbers did not have a gender. A column that balanced told the truth regardless of whose hand had balanced it, and Emma's columns always balanced. The baby arrived in November, almost exactly 1 year after Victor Collins had ridden away down the East Road. A girl with Luke's steady eyes and Emma's hands and a pair of lungs that announced her arrival to everyone in the house and possibly the barn. They named her Ruth. Emma held her daughter in the first hours and looked at her face, that ancient, new, already particular face, and felt something she hadn't felt since Ohio, since her father's hands at the small desk on Sunday afternoons. She felt the specific quality of a world that still had goodness in it. Not naive goodness. Not the goodness of a life that had been easy or a world that was fair. The harder kind. The kind you find on the other side of knowing exactly how wrong things can go and deciding to build anyway. Ruth grew. The ranch grew. The business Emma had built quietly on the foundation of honest numbers and reliable work grew with them until she was traveling to Cheyenne twice a year for meetings with clients whose names would have seemed impossible to her from the stagecoach window 4 years earlier. Sarah called her the most influential woman in the county. Hannah called her the best argument for education she had ever personally witnessed. Luke called her Emma and meant everything by it. One evening in the summer of 1892, 5 years after a terrified young woman had stepped off a stagecoach with one carpet bag and a sleeve pulled down over a bruise, Emma sat on the porch of the ranch house in the late gold of a Wyoming evening. Ruth was in the yard, 3 years old, and entirely without fear, chasing something through the grass with the absolute conviction of a child who has never learned that the world requires her to be small. Luke was beside Emma on the porch. Inside, through the open window, she could hear the sounds of a house that was fully inhabited, the presence of a life built on a foundation that held. She watched her daughter run and felt the years behind her like a country she had traveled through. The girl on the stagecoach with the shaking hands and the pulled-down sleeves. The nights in a locked room learning to breathe. The ledgers and the horses and the slow, earned rebuilding of a self that had been systematically dismantled. The moment in the yard with a rifle in her steady hands, telling the man who had tried to own her that he would not come back. The church in December with dried lavender and snow and a promise made between two people who understood its weight. She thought about what she had believed in the worst years about herself, that she was worth nothing, that she was owed nothing, that whatever was done to her was the cost of existing in a world that had not been designed with her in mind. She had believed those things not because they were true, but because she had been told them by someone who needed her to believe them, and she had been alone, and alone is where lies do their best work. She was not alone anymore. She had not been alone for a long time. "What are you thinking about?" Luke said. She watched Ruth catch whatever she had been chasing, a grasshopper, it turned out, which she examined with intense scientific interest before releasing it into the grass, and smiled. "I'm thinking about how far it is from St. Louis," Emma said. "Long way," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." He reached over and took her hand, and she let the gold light fall across both of them, and across the yard where her daughter was now lying flat in the grass, staring up at the enormous Wyoming sky with the total fearless openness of a child who had never been taught to make herself smaller. That child would grow up knowing her own name. She would grow up understanding that her mind was her own, and her body was her own, and her choices were her own, and that the people who loved her would not require her to be less than she was in order to feel secure. She would grow up watching her mother run accounts that 3 counties trusted and ride a gray mare with confidence and speak her mind plainly in rooms full of men who were learning to listen. She would grow up knowing what love looked like. Not the thing Victor Collins had called love, the locked doors and the inventoried debts and the systematic reduction of a person to something that could be managed. She would know the other kind. The kind that said, "You don't owe me trust. You only owe yourself time." The kind that watched and waited and held its hands open. The kind that stood beside you in a cold yard and said you won't stand alone, and then made it true. Emma Harper had run from everything she knew across 600 miles of broken country with one bag and a pulled-down sleeve and a terror so deep it lived in her muscles. She had arrived in a place she couldn't find on a map, and she had found against every reasonable expectation that the ground held. She had not been rescued. She had been given room enough to stand, and she had stood, and then she had built something so solid that it would outlast her. She had built it herself out of honest numbers and hard work, and the slow, deliberate choice made over and over again to stay. The grasshopper was gone. Ruth was on her feet again, running toward the porch with the total commitment of a 3-year-old who has just discovered something new to show her mother. Her boots were loud on the porch steps. Her face was lit up with the uncomplicated joy of a child who expected to be welcomed. Emma opened her arms, and her daughter ran into them, and she held her tight in the gold Wyoming evening and thought this is what survival was always supposed to become. Not the absence of pain, not the erasure of everything that had been done, but this exact weight in her arms, this specific evening, this life chosen built entirely and irrevocably hers. She had come to Wyoming with nothing but the truth of what she had survived, and she had made it bone by bone and choice by choice into everything.